The grief was a plot of land she owned, barren and fallow. For 6 years since John's death, Ilara had cultivated nothing but silence, her heart as unyielding as the cracked earth of the Blackwood Ranch. The doctor's words from a decade before had been the first frost, declaring her womb a desolate place. John's passing was the final, killing drought. Now, the wind that swept across her empty pastures whispered only of what was missing: the stomp of a second horse, the laughter of a child, the weight of a hand in hers. Her life was a meticulously kept, vacant house, and she was its lonely, vigilant caretaker. Then came the news, carried on the dusty breath of a late summer afternoon by a neighbor riding fence. Jedediah Croft, a man whose land bordered hers to the south, was dying. His lungs were filling with dust and disease, and his spirit was not far behind. His debt to Marcus Thorne, a man who collected land and souls with equal rapacity, had come due. The auction was set for Friday. They weren't just selling his parched acres and his skeletal cattle, they were selling his indenture. They were selling the man himself, and with him, his 2 starving children, twins no older than 7, with eyes as big and haunted as the prairie owls. Ilara felt a tremor in the fallow ground of her soul. It was an obscene spectacle, a man's ruin laid bare for the picking. She pictured Thorne, his smile a tight, satisfied seam in his fleshy face, ready to scoop up the remnants of a family for the price of a few silver dollars. On Friday, she hitched her wagon and rode into town. The air was thick with judgment and a grim, vulture-like anticipation. Silas Croft stood on the auction block, his shoulders slumped not just with illness but with a shame so profound it seemed to have physical weight. His children, a boy and a girl, clung to his legs, their faces buried in the worn fabric of his trousers. They were ghosts already, thin and silent. Thorne started the bidding, his voice slick with false sympathy. A good man, fallen on hard times. Let's start the bidding for his remaining indenture and the care of his offspring at $20. A murmur went through the small crowd. It was a paltry sum for a man's life, a price that declared him worthless. Ilara watched Thorne's eyes, cold and possessive, already claiming the children for whatever cruel purpose he had in mind, orphanage, or worse, servitude. A cold, hard certainty settled in Ilara's chest. It was not kindness. It was not pity. It was a deep, resonant defiance against the emptiness, against the universe that had taken everything and Thorne who sought to profit from it. When the auctioneer called for other bids, the silence was heavy and absolute. Then her voice, clear and steady, cut through it. $100. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. Heads turned. Thorne's gaze snapped to her, his eyes narrowing with disbelief and irritation. He had not factored her into his equation. She was the grieving widow, the recluse. 110, he sneered, testing her. 200, she replied without hesitation, her eyes locked on the 2 small heads hidden against their father's legs. Thorne's face flushed a deep, mottled red. This was no longer about profit, it was a challenge to his authority. 250, he barked. The air crackled. Silas Croft slowly lifted his head, his gaze finding Ilara's. In his eyes, she saw not gratitude, but a profound, shattering bewilderment. He was a piece of property they were haggling over. She held his gaze, a silent promise passing between them that she did not yet understand herself. $500, she said, her voice ringing with the finality of a judge's gavel. The sum was absurd, the price of a prime bull, more than the man and his failing land were worth in purely economic terms. Silence descended. Thorne stared at her, his mouth a thin, bloodless line. He gave a short, disgusted shake of his head and stepped back. The auctioneer, stunned, slammed his hammer down. Sold. To the widow Blackwood, Ilara did not feel triumph. She felt the terrifying weight of ownership. She walked to the clerk, paid the sum in solid gold coin she had kept buried since John's death, and received a piece of paper that declared Silas Croft and his children, Leo and Lily, her property until his debt was worked off or his life expired. She led them to her wagon, 3 silent figures trailing in her wake. The man, Silas, moved with the stiff pride of the damned. The children were utterly still, their small hands clutching each other's. As they rode back to the Blackwood Ranch, the silence in the wagon was different from the one she was used to. It was not empty. It was full of fear, uncertainty, and the sound of a dying man's labored breath. The front door of her house had not opened for strangers in 6 years. Now, it swung inward to admit 3 of them, spectres brought home from a Gaulish market. The house, her sanctuary of grief, seemed to hold its breath. Silas Croft stood just inside the threshold, his tall frame stooped, his eyes scanning the clean, orderly space with a weariness that went beyond bone. He would not step further. He was purchased, not invited. Beside him, the twins, Leo and Lily, were perfect statues of terror, their faces pale and smudged with dust, their hands still locked together in a desperate grip. Their silence was a physical presence, a wall she would have to breach. Ilara ignored the storm of emotions in the room, the shame, the fear, the suffocating uncertainty. She focused on the practical. The immediate. "The stew is on the stove," she said, her voice devoid of warmth but full of instruction. "There is water in the basin." She gestured toward the kitchen, then turned and walked away, giving them the space to be broken without her witness. From the hallway, she listened. The scrape of a chair. The clink of a spoon against a bowl. The small, hesitant sounds of life returning to her home were like the first drops of rain on parched ground. Later, she found the bowls scrubbed clean and stacked neatly by the sink. The children were asleep on a braided rug by the cold hearth, curled together like puppies, their hunger finally sated into a deep, exhausted slumber. Silas was standing by the window, staring out at the moon-drenched land that was now his prison. His cough echoed in the quiet room, a deep, rattling sound like stones in a dry well. She approached him not as a savior, but as a proprietor. "You are ill," she stated, not asked. He flinched but didn't turn. "It's just a cough." "It is more than a cough," she countered, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You will sleep in the spare room. The children can stay by the fire." He finally turned, and in the dim moonlight, she saw the full measure of his despair. It was not the look of a servant, but of a king who had lost his kingdom. "Why?" he asked, his voice a raw whisper. "Why did you do this?" Ilara had no answer for him, none that she could voice. "Because your children's eyes reminded me of a hollow I carry inside me. Because his cruelty was a mirror to my own lonely bitterness. Because I could not bear the silence for one more day." Instead, she gave him the only truth that felt solid. Thorn would not have been kind. She left a jar of her own herbal salve by his bedside, a potent mixture for the lungs that she used to make for John. It was an act of maintenance, not of tenderness. Or so she told herself. The days that followed fell into a rigid routine. Ilara would rise before dawn, tending to her chores. Silas, despite his rattling breath, would rise with her, his pride refusing to let him be idle. He mended a broken fence, his hands clumsy but determined. He sharpened tools that had grown dull with disuse. He never spoke unless spoken to. The children remained his silent shadows. But slowly, imperceptibly, a thawing began. It started not with words, but with actions. One morning, Ilara found a small, perfectly formed bird's nest on her porch railing, a fragile gift left by Leo. Another afternoon, while she was kneading bread, she felt a small tug on her apron. It was Lily, her eyes wide, holding out a single, vibrant prairie wildflower. Ilara stopped, her hands white with flour. She looked at the flower, then at the child. She took it, her fingers brushing the girl's small, cool hand. For a fleeting second, Lily's lips curved into a ghost of a smile before she scurried away. That night, Ilara did not put the flower in water. She pressed it between the pages of her Bible, a splash of impossible color in a book of black and white. She was fighting it, this creeping warmth in the cold corners of her heart. She had bought them. It was a contract. But as she watched Silas teach his son how to whittle a piece of wood, his hacking cough momentarily forgotten in a moment of fatherly grace, she felt the barren ground of her soul shift, as if preparing for a long-overdue spring. A month passed, then 2. The brutal summer heat gave way to the crisp, golden light of autumn. The change in season was mirrored on the ranch and in its new inhabitants. With steady food and the herbal remedies Ilara provided, the hollows in the children's cheeks began to fill. Their silence fractured, first with whispers to each other, then with single-word answers to Ilara's questions. One afternoon, a sound startled her as she came around the corner of the barn, a genuine, unbridled peal of laughter. Leah was chasing a chicken, his legs pumping with newfound energy, and Lily was clapping, her face bright with joy. The sound hit Ilara with the force of a physical blow, beautiful and painful all at once. It was the sound her home was built for, and the sound she had been sure she would never hear within its walls. Silas, too, was changing. The food and rest had put a measure of strength back into his limbs. He worked beside her now, not as an indentured servant, but as a partner. They moved with a silent, synchronized rhythm, repairing the barn roof, clearing a new pasture, their hands often brushing in the shared labor. The cough remained, a grim reminder of the debt his body still owed, but it was less frequent. He started to meet her gaze, his eyes holding not just gratitude, but a quiet, questioning intensity. The hearth, once a cold monument of stone, was now the center of their evenings. After the children were asleep, Silas and Ilara would sit in the flickering firelight, the silence between them no longer fraught with tension, but comfortable, layered with unspoken understanding. The foundling family was becoming real. And then, the shadow fell. A lone rider on the horizon, a dark speck against the setting sun. Ilara knew before the figure was close enough to recognize. It was Marcus Thorne. He rode into the yard not with the bluster of a bully, but with the smug confidence of a man who owned the world. He dismounted slowly, his eye sweeping over the ranch, noting the mended fences, the healthy-looking chickens, the undeniable signs of life. His gaze settled on Silas, who stood protectively near the porch, then on the children peeking from behind the door. "Blackwood," Thorne said, his voice a low drawl that dripped with condescension. He ignored Silas completely. "I see you're putting my property to good use." Ilara stepped forward, placing herself between Thorne and her house. "He is not your property, a technicality." Thorne waved a dismissive hand. "You bought the man's labor, but the debt on his land remains. A debt I now own. This pathetic little patch of dirt will be mine soon enough." He smiled, a cruel, predatory expression. "And when he finally coughs his last breath, what happens to the orphans then? The county has places for children like that. Cold places." The threat was clear, hanging in the air like poison. He was waiting for Silas to die. He was waiting to dismantle everything she had just begun to build. A fierce, cold rage, utterly different from her grief, solidified in Ilara's core. This was no longer about filling an emptiness in her life. This was about protecting it. She looked at Thorne, her face a mask of calm fury. Her voice was low, but it carried the weight of iron. "This is my ranch. That is my house. And those are my children. They are not for sale." Thorne's smile faltered. He had expected the grieving, reclusive widow, not this granite-willed woman standing before him. He saw something in her eyes he did not understand and did not like. He grunted, remounted his horse, and gave one last, lingering look at the house, at the children, at Silas. "We will see," he said, and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust and dread behind him. That night, the comfortable silence was gone, replaced by a tense vigilance. After the children were asleep, Ilara took John's old rifle from its place above the mantel, checked its action, and placed it on the table beside her. She sat in the dark, watching the moonlit horizon, a sentinel guarding a fragile, burgeoning hope. And in that moment, watching the steady rise and fall of Silas's chest as he slept in the chair opposite her, she finally admitted the truth to herself. She had not just bought a family. She had fallen in love with a dying man. The wake of Thorne's visit was a quiet, shared dread that bound Ilara and Silas even closer. The unspoken thing between them had been given a name and a face. It was the face of greed, and it threatened to devour the fragile world they had constructed. They worked with a new urgency, their movements economical, their conversation sparse but significant. Every repaired harness, every cleared acre was an act of defiance. One evening, as a chill wind stripped the last leaves from the cottonwood trees, they sat by the fire, the sleeping children a bundled mound of peace nearby. The silence stretched until it became a vessel, waiting to be filled. It was Silas who filled it. "My Mary," he began, his voice raspy, his eyes fixed on the flames. "She was like you. Strong. Knew the land. She died birthing them." He paused, the cough shaking his frame. "I failed her. I failed this land. I was so afraid for them. So ashamed that all I could give them was my own ruin." The confession hung in the air, raw and painful. Elara felt the walls around her own carefully guarded heart begin to crumble. She looked at this man, who carried the weight of his own perceived failures like a shroud, and saw not weakness, but a profound and devastating love for his children. "I had a husband," she heard herself say, the words feeling strange on her tongue. "His name was John. He was a good man. We wanted children more than anything." She stared into the fire, seeing ghosts in the embers. The silence in this house after he was gone. It was a living thing. A predator. I thought it had eaten me whole for the first time. They were not a proprietor and her property, not a savior and her ward. They were two people, hollowed out by grief, finding solace in the shared geography of their pain. Silas reached across the space between them, his calloused, hesitant hand covering hers. His touch was warm, real. A promise. Outside, the wind began to howl. The sky, which had been clear moments before, was now a roiling mass of black clouds. A storm was coming, a physical manifestation of the tempest that had been brewing. It hit the ranch with biblical fury. Rain lashed against the windows like handfuls of gravel, and the wind screamed like a banshee. The house groaned under the assault. Leo and Lily awoke, crying out in fear, and Elara brought them to the hearth, wrapping them in blankets and her own steady presence. Through the din of the storm, she heard it. The barking of the dog, frantic and sharp. Then, the splintering of wood from the direction of the outer fence. Silas was on his feet in an instant, his eyes meeting hers. They both knew. Thorn. He had used the storm's cover. The front door burst open, crashing against the wall, and Marcus Thorn stood there, flanked by two rough-looking men, all of them soaked and hardened by the rain and their cruel intentions. "The land is mine, widow," Thorn bellowed over the wind. "I've come to collect." But Elara was no longer just the widow. Silas was no longer just the dying rancher. They were a fortress. What happened next was not a grand battle, but a blur of desperate, primal action. Silas, his illness forgotten in a surge of adrenaline, grabbed a heavy iron poker from the hearth. He met the first man with a roar of pure protective rage. Elara shoved the terrified children behind her, snatched the rifle from the table, and leveled it. The world narrowed to the sight at the end of the barrel, to Thorn's shocked and furious face. A shot cracked through the storm's roar. One of Thorn's men crumpled to the floor. The other, seeing the dead certainty in Elara's eyes and the ferocity in Silas's defense, hesitated. That hesitation cost him. Silas brought the poker down in a brutal, decisive arc. Thorn, his cowardly plan collapsing, stared in disbelief from Elara to the fallen men. He saw no fear in her, only a promise of a grave. He turned and fled into the screaming storm, a pathetic retreat into the chaos he had unleashed. As suddenly as it began, it was over. The house was a wreck of shattered wood and chilling silence, the only sound the whimpering of the children and the ragged, painful gasps from Silas's lungs. The storm outside began to recede, its fury spent. Elara lowered the rifle, her body trembling, and went to Silas, who was leaning against the wall, the poker slipping from his grasp. The fight was won, but the cost was etched on his face. The dawn that broke after the storm was pristine and quiet. The air, washed clean by the rain, smelled of wet earth and new beginnings. The bodies of Thorn's men were gone, dealt with in the grim, silent hours before sunrise, a final, somber chore performed by Elara and a faltering Silas. They had buried the violence, but its ghost remained. It lingered in the splintered doorframe and in the deep, rattling cough that now racked Silas's body without mercy. The battle had taken the last of his reserves, burning through the fragile strength he had so carefully rebuilt. He knew it. Ilara knew it. The victory had been a Pyrrhic one. There would be no more fighting external enemies. The final battle was to be fought within the walls of the home they had defended, against an enemy that could not be shot or struck down. It was a battle against time. Their days took on a new, poignant rhythm. They were no longer trying to build a future, they were trying to build a legacy. Every moment became precious, imbued with a quiet, desperate love. Silas, though weakened, spent his hours with Leo and Lily. He sat on the porch, his breath labored, and taught Leo how to read the clouds and predict the weather. He showed Lily how to braid tough strands of leather into a strong rope, his large, clumsy hands guiding her small, nimble ones. He was pouring all that he was, all that he knew, into them, ensuring a part of him would remain rooted in this land. In the evenings, he and Ilara would sit together, the children asleep nearby. They spoke little, but their silence was a deep and abiding conversation. She would hold his hand, feeling the fever that burned beneath his skin, and he would look at her, his eyes full of a love that was as vast and profound as the prairie sky. They had found a lifetime of love in a handful of seasons, a love made more intense by its fleeting nature. There was no cure. There was only acceptance, a graceful and heartbreaking surrender. One afternoon, under a sky the color of a robin's egg, he called her to his bedside. The children were outside, their laughter a testament to the life he had secured for them. His breathing was shallow, a soft, fluttering sound. He took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "Ilara," he whispered, his voice a thread of sound. She leaned close, her heart aching with a grief that was sharper and more painful than any she had ever known. "Promise me," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Promise you'll raise them." "As your own they are my own," she whispered, a tear finally tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. They always were. A faint smile touched his lips, a look of profound peace settling over his features. "My Mary would have loved you," he said. He closed his eyes, his last breath a gentle sigh of release. He did not die a broken, indebted man on an auction block. He died a king in his own home, in the arms of the woman he loved, his kingdom safe, his lineage secure. His death was not a tragedy. It was a final, perfect act of love. Years passed. The camera that was memory panned slowly across a thriving ranch. The fences were strong, the barn was painted a deep, rich red, and the fields were green and heavy with grain. On the porch sat Ilara, her hair now streaked with silver, her face etched with the lines of time and weather, but her eyes held a deep, unshakable peace. A tall, strong young man with his father's quiet eyes worked nearby, mending a saddle. A graceful young woman with her mother's smile tended to a garden overflowing with vibrant flowers. Leo and Lily. They were no longer silent, haunted children, but confident young adults, at home in the world their parents had built for them. The barren woman and the empty land were both fertile now, overflowing with a harvest of love and life. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, they gathered on the porch, the three of them. Leo leaned against a post, Lily sat on the steps, and Ilara rested in her rocking chair. A comfortable, familiar silence settled over them, not of emptiness, but of absolute belonging. The promise had been kept. The grief had become a garden. They were a family, silhouetted against the setting sun, a testament to the fact that love, once planted, could reclaim even the most desolate of lands.